You want to take a deep dive into what's really happening in North Korea today? Well, we've got a pretty unique perspective for you. We're talking first-hand accounts from a former North Korean spy.
Yeah, it's not every day you get a glimpse behind the curtain like this. I mean, we're talking about a regime that is shrouded in secrecy, and this is someone who was right there operating within their intelligence apparatus.
Exactly. We read headlines about North Korea, but this is different, you know? This is hearing from someone who's walked those streets, experienced that secrecy firsthand. And let me tell you, this former spy had some pretty startling insights, especially about the Otto Warmbier case. We're talking stuff you won't find in your typical news cycle.
Yeah, the Otto Warmbier case.
Yeah.
Such a tragic story that, as you know, really captured the world's attention. This young American college student detained in North Korea, accused of trying to steal a propaganda poster.
A poster, can you imagine? It seems almost surreal. And for that, he gets sentenced to hard labor, falls into a coma, and tragically dies just days after being released. And the lack of clarity around what happened to him, it just fueled so much global outrage and suspicion.
Absolutely. And this is where our interview takes a turn that might surprise you. See, the former spy suggests that Warmbier's death, while undeniably a tragedy, might not have been from the physical torture that a lot of people suspected. Instead, they describe something far more calculated and, frankly, far more unsettling.
Okay, now I'm on the edge of my seat. What are we talking about here? What really happened, according to this former spy?
Well, the interviewee alleges that North Korea has actually incorporated these sophisticated drugs into their, I guess you could say, arsenal. But we're not talking about your everyday narcotics. This is next-level stuff, substances that they claim can induce specific medical conditions in a way that leaves almost no trace.
So we're talking about a level of medical manipulation that could easily be mistaken for natural causes. I mean, it'd be nearly impossible to prove foul play.
Exactly. And the former spy suggests that North Korea could use these drugs to do things like coerce confessions, put pressure on other countries, and all the while they can maintain plausible deniability on the world stage. They even suggest that these tactics might have been used before on individuals like Kim Jong-nam, Kim Jong-un's half-brother.
This is all starting to sound like something out of a spy thriller. But if this is true, I mean, what are the implications for international relations, for the safety of anyone who even steps foot in North Korea?
Those are the big questions, right? And it's worth noting that shortly after this former spy started speaking out publicly, they received a, let's just say, rather unsettling phone call from someone claiming to be from North Korea.
Oh, wow. That sends chills down my spine. Did they say what they wanted?
They didn't get into specifics, but, the implication was crystal clear. Just a not-so-subtle reminder of who they were dealing with and the risks that come with revealing such closely guarded secrets.
So even though this person managed to defect, it sounds like freedom comes with a pretty hefty price tag. They're still living under the shadow of their past.
Yeah, it certainly seems that way. That constant tension, that fear of reprisal, it speaks volumes about what life is really like under a regime like that. But I think it also highlights just how significant their testimony is. I mean, it shows the lengths this regime might go to in order to silence dissent.
Absolutely. But this interview, it wasn't just about the Otto Warmbier case or even just espionage, right? It gave us a glimpse into the everyday lives of people living in this incredibly secretive nation. That's a perspective you just don't come across every day.
Yeah, that's right. One thing that I found fascinating is that the interviewee describes North Korea as being in this state of flux, grappling with these unintended consequences of a more market-driven economy that Kim Jong-un has kind of allowed to emerge.
Okay, now that's interesting. How does that even work? A market economy in a communist country.
Yeah, it seems contradictory. It's not a completely free market by any stretch, but there's been this noticeable shift towards private enterprise, especially in the last decade or so. And while that has led to some improvements in living conditions for certain segments of society, it's also created this whole new generation that's not as tethered to the state's ideology.
Which makes sense. You can't really control the flow of information and ideas as easily when people have a bit more economic freedom. And this is where the former spy drew that fascinating parallel to, millennials and Gen Z here in the West, referring to this emerging demographic as North Korea's MZ generation.
Yes. And it's an interesting comparison. This generation, much like millennials and Gen Z globally, they're more connected, they're more exposed to influences beyond their borders, and they're way less likely to just accept the status quo without questioning it.
Which, of course, creates a direct challenge to Kim Jong-un's grip on power. So, given everything we've talked about, the nuclear threats, these internal pressures, this new generation that's not as tied to the regime's ideology, Where does North Korea go from here? Is there any realistic chance for denuclearization?
I think that's the million-dollar question, right? And unfortunately, the former spy doesn't exactly offer much hope. They believe that denuclearization, at least in the current climate, is very unlikely.
Why do you think that is? I mean, there have been talks, sanctions, international pressure. Why does the Kim regime cling so tightly to its nuclear program?
Well, according to the interviewee for the Kim regime, nuclear weapons aren't just about security anymore. They become synonymous with the regime's very survival. Giving them up would basically be like admitting defeat, which in their eyes could lead to the collapse of the entire system.
So they're trapped by their own rhetoric, by this image of strength they've spent decades building up?
Precisely. And they seem willing to cling to that image, no matter the cost, even if it means inflicting further hardship on their own people.
It's a scary thought when you really think about it. A nation's identity so tied to having nuclear weapons makes you wonder about the people. What's daily life like under that kind of regime?
Yeah, you're right. It's a crucial point and something that this interview really drove home for me. It's easy to get caught up in the geopolitical stuff, but we can't forget there are real people living with the consequences of all this.
And speaking of consequences, the interviewee painted a pretty grim picture of what things have been like in North Korea since the pandemic hit. They said something like, people don't know if they'll die from the virus or from starvation. Just heartbreaking.
Yeah. The pandemic has really exposed how fragile North Korea really is. You see, their economy was already on shaky ground, heavily reliant on trade with China. Then the borders shut down, and that lifeline was cut off, leaving them extremely vulnerable.
You said their economy was already fragile. For those of us who might not know much about North Korea's history, can you give us a little background on that?
Sure. Back in the 1990s, North Korea went through this devastating famine. They call it the Arduous March. It was brutal. Widespread starvation, hundreds of thousands of deaths, maybe even millions.
Millions. Wow, that's just unimaginable. And the interviewee seemed to suggest that what's happening now, especially with the pandemic on top of everything else, could actually be even worse.
That's right. And to hear someone who is a high-ranking official draw those parallels, it's incredibly alarming. Really speaks to the severity of the situation they're dealing with.
It's incredibly bleak, and yet there was just something about the interviewee, how they carry themselves. Even with everything they've been through, even with the risks they're taking, just by talking to us, they seemed, I don't know, hopeful.
Yeah, I noticed that too. It was remarkable, wasn't it? This kind of unwavering resilience, like this determination to find those little glimmers of hope, even in the darkest situations. They talked a lot about focusing on what they could control, even if it was just their own mindset, their own outlook.
That's a really powerful message, especially from someone who's witnessed firsthand the kind of things this regime is capable of. It makes you wonder if this is how someone who is so deeply embedded within the system sees things. I mean, what are the chances for real change in North Korea?
It's the question, right? It's what world leaders have been trying to figure out for decades. Is real change even possible in a system as tightly controlled as North Korea's? And if so, where does that change even begin?
That's what I really want to understand. Did the interviewee give any insight into what a path forward might look like, no matter how difficult it might be? Like, were there any actions they thought the international community could take?
They didn't really offer any easy answers, which, given everything we've talked about, isn't surprising. But they were very clear about one thing. The Kim regime is incredibly adept at weathering storms. They know how to exploit divisions on the world stage, and they're masters of propaganda, using it to maintain their control.
So, if sanctions and diplomatic pressure aren't working, what options are left? Is there any way to break through that wall of isolation and control?
Well, the interviewee seemed to believe that any lasting change, any real change, would have to come from within North Korea itself. They emphasized just how much awareness of the outside world has been growing among ordinary North Koreans. And a lot of that is thanks to smuggled cell phones and access to foreign media.
That's a testament to the power of information, isn't it? Even in one of the most closed-off places on Earth, those little cracks of light, they still find a way to shine through. Is the interviewee suggesting that this new generation, the MZ generation, could they be the ones to bring about change?
That's a possibility they seem to be hinting at. They talked about how this younger generation, because they're exposed to even just glimpses of a different way of life, things like South Korean dramas, they're not as likely to just blindly accept the regime's propaganda.
Yeah, it reminds me of those stories you hear about people in North Korea risking everything just to get their hands on foreign films and shows. Like, they're desperate for a different story, a different way of seeing the world.
Exactly. And it might seem like a small act of defiance, listening to a foreign radio station or watching a smuggled movie, but that exposure to different viewpoints, it's powerful. It plants these seeds of doubt, of questioning, of imagining a different future. And over time, who knows, those seeds, they have the potential to blossom into something much, much bigger.
It does feel like, I don't know, we're all kind of holding our breath, waiting to see if those seeds of change will actually grow into something, some kind of ripple effect. But I guess there's just no way to know when or how that might happen.
You said it. That's what makes North Korea such a puzzle and such a source of anxiety, really, for the whole world. There's one more thing from this interview I wanted to circle back to. The former spy's take on the Kim regime and biological weapons.
Oh, right. We talked about those advanced drugs earlier. Pretty disturbing stuff, especially given everything else we've learned.
It's all part of their pursuit of what you'd call asymmetrical power. They know they can't go toe-to-toe with a country like the U.S. in a conventional military sense. So they've poured a ton of resources into these other, less conventional and honestly sneakier forms of power.
Which brings us right back to Otto Warmbier. The interviewee seemed totally convinced that those drugs, not torture, were the cause of his death.
Yeah. And it really makes you wonder if they're willing to use something like that on a foreigner, someone who attracted so much international attention. What are they capable of doing to their own people, the people who don't have a voice on the world stage?
It's just, I don't know, a chilling reminder of everything we don't see happening inside North Korea. It's easy to get caught up in the headlines, the nuclear stuff, but there's a whole other world happening that we're not privy to.
And that's exactly why it's so important to give people like this former spy a platform. They're giving us this incredibly rare glimpse into that world and how this regime thinks and operates. If we want any chance of responding to this situation, we need to understand it, really understand it.
So where do we go from here? I mean, what can any of us, even as individuals, do in the face of something this big and complicated?
It's easy to feel powerless, for sure, but I really do believe that awareness is the most important thing. Stay informed, ask questions, challenge your own assumptions, and whatever you do, don't let this issue fall off your radar.
It's true. There's so much going on in the world these days. It's easy to forget about these huge critical situations until suddenly they're impossible to ignore.
Exactly. And remember,
Yeah.
this is about real people's lives, millions of them right now, living in North Korea under constant surveillance, deprived of basic freedoms. And their situation is getting more and more desperate. They deserve to be heard.
This deep dive has been really eye-opening. A good reminder that behind all the politics, behind the headlines, there are real lives hanging in the balance.
I think that's what we need to remember. We can't look away. We can't allow ourselves to become numb to the suffering, to the injustice. We have a responsibility to pay attention, to speak up, and to hope for a better future for the people of North Korea.
I couldn't agree more. And on that note, we'll leave you with the words of our interviewee, the former North Korean spy who risked it all to tell their story. We hope this inspires you to seek out even more perspectives on this incredibly complex issue, to keep learning, and to never forget the human cost of this struggle. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.